Nice job. We are going to give folks a couple minutes to trickle in. Welcome, everybody. Amazing. All right. Welcome, everyone. We are going to get started. I am Allie Vanier, Program Manager for the Lenfest Institute for Journalism. I have just a couple of housekeeping items before we jump into this wonderful panel. Our event principles are on the main page of the Zoom events platform. And we'll also post them in the chat in a minute. This session is being recorded. We will share the recording out publicly following the summit for everyone who wasn't able to join us live. There is closed captioning available. So if you would like to see those, you can just click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. And if you're having any technical difficulties at all, you can either direct message me or my colleague Haley, and we'll help you out. Last but not least, we will be using the Q&A feature. So we'll have plenty of time towards the end of the session to take your questions for our panelists. So use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to pose those questions. And we highly, highly encourage those. Okay, so all of that said, I am super happy to introduce this session that we're calling The Power of Public Funding with a really amazing roster of folks who have deep experience in government-funded journalism initiatives. On this panel, we have Mike Rispoli, Senior Director of Journalism Policy at Free Press and a board member for the New Jersey Civic Information Consortium. We have Krista Scharfenberg, Director of the California Local Journalism Fellowship Program, Rashad Mahmood, Executive Director of the New Mexico Local News Fund, and last but certainly not least, Deanna Blinton, Civic Partnerships Manager at El Timpano. So to get us started, I'm going to hand it over to Mike just to kind of discuss the current landscape of public funding for journalism and set the stage a bit.
Thanks, Allie. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy that you all are with us today. It's really great to be on this panel with all these amazing people. Thanks for Lenfest for organizing this. So before we get into all the different things that are happening around public funding around the country, I'm going to just share a little bit about why public funding is kind of becoming much more a part of the conversation when it comes to the future of local news in the United States. No surprise to anyone, not sharing anything shocking right now, but local news right now is undergoing significant economic and technological shifts, resulting in a lot of commercial newspapers disappearing and journalists being laid off. Resulting in a lot of communities not being covered, not getting the information that they need. And as we're kind of shifting into this new system and we're seeing nonprofits emerge, we're seeing new types of models of better informing communities take shape. The economics of local news is going to look different as a result of this new system emerging. There is not as much commercial revenue anymore in the local news business as there used to be. And so what we are starting to see is this rise in philanthropy. Obviously, philanthropic giving towards local news is really increasing and has been increasing and continues to. And we're also starting to see policymakers take seriously the idea of the need for a vibrant and local and community-rooted local news system. And so because that commercial revenue is not there anymore, and because we can't necessarily expect philanthropy to do it alone, policymakers at the local, state, and national level are looking at ways that public policy, specifically public funding, can be used to help support news production, engaging communities, and in particular, reaching folks in communities that have not really been well served by legacy media, in particular, BIPOC communities, non-English speaking immigrant communities, people experiencing economic poverty, as well as rural and small towns. And as policymakers are looking to inject more public funding into the local news system, this kind of question is arising, and a good question of what does this mean for editorial independence? And there's always kind of been a strong independent streak in journalism, as there should be. We don't want governments meddling with the editorial side of things. But whether it's legislation in New Jersey or Chicago or New York or California or New Mexico, we're seeing legislation come up that is implementing kind of firewalls and safeguards in place to protect editorial independence, which is important. But the reality of it is that it's kind of hard to expect that we can create a local news system that serves communities without some sort of form of public policy or direct public funding. And so we're going to talk today a little bit about what those different models are. We're seeing things like nonprofit grant-making bodies using public funding in New Jersey, to government giving money to universities to place reporters in underserved communities. We're seeing places like in Chicago, New York, where government ad spending, where at least half of government ad spending needs to go towards communities and ethnic media. So there's a lot of new models arising, and that's a good thing. That's really exciting, because as this new system around local news and community engagement and nonprofit journalism, as that system is kind of rising, we need public policy to also match that, to help cultivate and support this new emergent system. And so we're still kind of early days in seeing these new forms of local news policy take shape, but all signs are very promising thus far. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from all the folks who have that on the ground experience and how these policies are taking shape. The one quick thing I would note too is that as folks are kind of listening to this, I would really kind of encourage folks to think about what this might look like in their community, what this might look like in their state. And we'll talk a little bit later on with some ideas or ways for people to learn more about public funding, to get involved in policy making in a way that is adherent to journalistic ethics and standards. So I'll pass it back to you, Allie.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for kind of grounding us in that. I'm going to hand it over to Rashad now to talk to us a little bit about what's happening in New Mexico.
Hey, everyone. Excuse me. Hey, everyone. Great to meet you. In case you don't know me, I'm Rashad. I'm the executive director of the New Mexico Local News Fund. And I just pasted a link in chat to some information about the fellowship program that I'm going to be talking about. And so basically, this program got started pretty much right at the beginning of the Local News Fund. We were looking around, what are some ways that we could support the local news ecosystem. We talked with a bunch of stakeholders. Obviously, newsrooms felt they needed more staff, more help in the newsroom. But more importantly, young people felt like there wasn't an easy pathway to get their journalism careers started in New Mexico, in the state that they grew up in, that they went to school in, that they loved. And so we started this fellowship program to meet both those needs. And it's been really incredibly successful. But so far, all the funding has come from private foundations, from individual donations, from our core operating budget, essentially. And so, frankly, we really got inspired by Mike over at Free Press. Thank you, Mike. And the New Jersey Civic Information Consortium, which was really, I think, the pioneering initiative in this new area to explore public support for local news. And so just in the summer of 2021, I was brainstorming with our local news fund staff, and we were like, you know what? If they're trying this in New Jersey, why can't we try something like this in New Mexico? And so really just hearing about it just got us to start trying. And so our first steps were, what are some potential policy ideas that would work here? We just reached out to a bunch of contacts that we knew that are active in policy in New Mexico. And then my colleague, Mark Glazer, his senator is actually Senator Peter Wirth, who's the current Senate Majority Leader. And so he literally just sent him a cold email and said, hey, we have this idea, we'd love to talk to you about it. And he responded and said, yes, let's sit down and talk about it. And really, he and every other legislator that we've talked to has instantly gotten the logic of public support for local news. Legislators are the ones on the front lines seeing the fact that their communities don't have access to the news and information they need, right? They want to be able to get their message out to the community. And if there's not a local news outlet, then there's no way to even let people know that you're doing a great job for your community, hopefully a good job for your community. And so it was honestly way easier than I thought to get public support. And so I guess my overall takeaway for people is to just start reaching out and talking to people and start these conversations around what's possible in your state, especially if you're in a smaller state where it's a little easier to get into to have direct contact with policymakers and build up those relationships. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised about the interest that you'll find when talking to legislators. So the reason we structured it the way we are structuring it, which I'll talk about in a sec, is a few different reasons. When we approached Senator Worth, we had a ton of different ideas, right? We could have gone with something like the Civic Information Consortium. We could have gone with some sort of subsidy model. We could have done something with state level marketing and advertising. But really the idea that appealed to him and everyone else that we've talked to is funding our fellowship program, because for a few different reasons. One, it's an already existing program with a proven track record of success. Two, it's also a job training program. And, state legislators really, see their part of their job is supporting their state's economy. And so providing a career pathway for journalists is just intuitively very appealing as a legislative solution. And then also the fellows are from all over New Mexico, and then they're placed in news outlets all across the state. And so it naturally just builds a broad base of support, because people can see oh, I had a fellow in my district and they did an amazing job and it improved the local access to local news and information in my community. So that's why we ended up going with that model. And so just to make things really practical, I thought I'd just sort of run through a quick timeline of how long it took, so that you can sort of, obviously every state's going to be different, laws are going to be different, processes are going to be different, but this is just our experience in New Mexico to just sort of help you get an idea of what to expect. So summer 2021, we brainstormed, we got in touch with Mike and was like, Mike, tell us more about the Civic Information Consortium and what that process was like, which he was very generous to do. And then fall 2021, we had conversations with legislators. Our first conversation with our eventual sponsor, Senator Worth, was fall of 2021. And then New Mexico has a part-time legislature, so they meet January to March-ish, depending on the year. And so we knew we were probably going to be too late for last year's legislative session. And so we really decided to target the legislative session that's going on right now. In spring of 2022, we really sort of honed the model through further conversations with policymakers. We did research on New Mexico law, like what other structures exist. In the summer of 2022, the University of New Mexico, who hosts our fellowship program, has an internal process for asking for state support. So that's one thing, I don't know, just be aware of existing structures and systems and don't try to, just necessarily completely reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. So we applied for that process within the university. Unfortunately, we didn't get it, which is understandable. It's kind of a new initiative, a little bit outside of the university's wheelhouse. Even though they were already doing it, they were doing it with funding from us, right? And so after we didn't get it, we were like, okay, well, let's just go straight to the legislature. And then since then, we've been talking with legislators from both parties, getting members of the public to support us, lobbyists for the Press Association and the Broadcasters Association in New Mexico. There's other sort of media adjacent organizations that are supportive. And so, it's really about building a broad coalition, getting as much one-on-one time with legislators as you can to get their support. And then unique to New Mexico, we're trying to get it written into the state budget, essentially. And so we needed a department that would be host to the funds. And so we had a great conversation with the Secretary of Workforce Solutions here, and she was generous enough to say that she supported the initiative. And so it'll, assuming all goes well with the current legislative session, it'll be written into their budget. And then we'll have the money to expand our fellowship program. And so I think the key takeaways are, one, just start talking to people about what's possible. I hope you'll be pleasantly surprised. Two is, I think, the fact that we started with private funding and had a demonstrated model of success was really appealing to legislators. There's been a lot of programs in New Mexico where someone's like, oh, let's start this answer to a problem, but they've never done it before. And then the state has to implement it, and, it has challenges, right? And then, there's also some appeal to it being an innovative model. The fact that, at least when we started our talks, we were the very first ones to do something like this. And then I'm probably taking way too much time, but I do just want to mention before I throw it back that, we had some conversations with the organizers in California that were also similarly engaging with the exact same process, brainstorming around what would be a great policy solution. And I was really happy to talk about our potential fellowship model, and then, which I think played a small role in eventually Krista's program getting passed, which was obviously way more money than anything possible in New Mexico, which is really incredible. So I'll end there, and I'm really happy to join at the end for more concrete discussion questions if anyone has anything they want to add. Allie, back to you.
Great. Thanks, Rashad. And yes, please put your questions in the Q&A for our panelists. That's a great segue now into Krista to talk about the work that's happening in California.
Thanks, Allie. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I was just listening to Rashad tell the story of how their project came about. Ours also was spearheaded by one person, but it was actually somebody in the legislature who started thinking about this project and spent a whole year figuring out the best way to do something in California. So there was one senator who has a passion, a state senator who has a passion for local news and understands what the disappearance of it means for democracy, and started looking about a year before Berkeley Journalism School got the money, looking into possible ways of crafting legislation in California. And really set out to explore a variety of models and engaged people throughout the state and across the country, including Mike, and as Rashad said, including Rashad, to think about the best way to do it here. And I think because California is a big and complicated state, the process was big and complicated. And without going into all the details, I'm going to sort of gloss over it, but there was they explored different models and ran up against a fair amount of resistance. I think there was a lot of interest in coming up with a solution in California, but there was concern about government influence over the program. So if there was a government agency giving out money to newsrooms, what would that mean in terms of political influence? That was a concern. There were also concerns about what kind of newsrooms would be eligible for public funding in the state. And eventually, after about a year of trying, a lot of the kind of negotiations and ideas broke down. But the Senator Stephen Glazier, who was trying to sponsor legislation, was determined to do something and called a few journalism schools around the state, possibly for some of the reasons that Rashad mentioned, that there was already, the state funds these universities. There's already kind of a mechanism for doing something through the schools. I'm not totally sure if that was the thinking, actually. But his office called a few universities to see, was there an idea that would make sense And the journalism school at Berkeley already had an idea for a local news fellowship for its graduates to sort of encourage and incentivize people to go into local news. And so they pitched that idea, and probably based in part on conversations with Rashad, and just this idea that maybe fellowships are less politically challenging than some other ways of doing this funding. They kind of landed on an idea of expanding the journalism school's vision to having this be a fellowship program for anybody around the state, not just Berkeley graduates. So in September of 2022, this got put into the state budget as a line item to provide $25 million to launch this fellowship program. It happened very quickly for the journalism school, like almost overnight. And so I quickly came in and started in mid-October of last year to kind of put meat on the bones and get the project launched this year. So like the New Mexico program, and unlike the New Jersey program, our project is not funding newsrooms and local news projects directly. It's more of a talent development program with a sort of focus on launching the careers of early career journalists and filling critical reporting gaps in local news organizations around the state. So over the next 3 years, we'll place approximately 120 fellows in newsrooms throughout California. There's going to be 3 cohorts of fellows, 40 each year, doing 2-year fellowships. There'll be an optional 3rd year for a subset of each cohort. And this is for early career journalists, so people which we're defining as people with under 5 years of experience. We're not going to have an educational requirement, so we have done a lot of outreach to the journalism programs around the state at UCs, CSUs, and the California State University System, and community colleges. But we're not requiring that people have gone to journalism school or even gone to college at all. So if they have not, we're just going to ask that people have about 2 years of newsroom experience so they can kind of hit the ground running. We've been building a kind of coalition of newsrooms all over the state to potentially host fellows. And we're really putting a focus on smaller newsrooms and newsrooms that are in, operating in underserved communities. We have done outreach to everyone we can, big, medium, small, urban, suburban, rural. We're reaching out to everyone, but we really want to make this project work for smaller newsrooms and work for community and ethnic media outlets. And so we're designing every step of it with that in mind. And to that point, we're building in a really strong training and mentoring program for the fellows, just recognizing that most newsrooms, even the big ones, don't have the resources often necessary to invest in early career journalists. So we really want to make this successful for the fellows and successful for the newsroom, so they're getting meaningful reporting from these fellows. We announced our advisory board yesterday, and Mike is on it. He's the one non-Californian on the advisory board. It's made up of journalism educators and newsroom leaders around the state, and that will be the group that will help us with selecting the newsrooms and the fellows. So we're really committed to an open, transparent process where everybody will be sort of evaluated using the same criteria, which is just critically important since this is a publicly funded program. And we need to make sure that right off the bat, we're really proving that this is for the whole state of California, and that we're just being very deliberate about how we're sort of spreading the resources around the state. And I just wanted to mention, it hasn't launched yet. I should say that we're about to open the application process, and the fellows will begin later this year for the first time. So it's all theoretical now, but we're already seeing some really exciting potential for collaborations and leveraging resources across news organizations. So there's news organizations starting to think about applying for fellows jointly. I mean, they'd each individually apply, but they would pool resources to hire an editor, and we may be able to help with funding some of this, but to work with the fellows across newsrooms. There's some interesting ideas coming up about collaborations between ethnic media and mainstream media to maybe share a fellow and do some joint reporting. So I think there's some exciting possibilities there that we want to help facilitate if we can. And I should just point out that one of the problems that we want to try to solve is how to support fellows in rural communities and in really small newsrooms where there just might not be any editing resources. So that's where these collaborative ideas, I think, could just be enormously helpful. That if we are putting someone somewhere where they might be the only reporter, how do we make sure that they have the support and kind of connection to the community around them? So that's the plan. Again, the first 40 will be sort of fielded into the field later this year. As we're moving forward, we've got a couple of kind of questions that are top of mind for us. And one is just around sustainability for the newsrooms. It's not exactly the mandate of this program, but I really want to help where we can help newsrooms think about how to keep these positions open beyond the 2 years. So it's not just a short-term Band-Aid. We're thinking a lot. We've sort of gone the opposite way of New Mexico, where we have public funding first. And so we're thinking about what is the role of private philanthropy to come in alongside the public funding, either to fund aspects of the program that the public funding can't be used for or won't be used for, or to keep it going beyond this first round of funding. And just so you all know, we're also planning a very rigorous kind of research and evaluation project where we will be completely honest and transparent about what we're learning, because we do, assuming this is all successful, care very much that it's a model for other states to copy and learn from. So we plan to share all of that along the way. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Krista. I think it's just so great to kind of understand the model that you're building. It also just occurred to me that we should have this panel again in a year so we can hear about, after we've kind of, some of this has actually happened. So Mike, your work at the New Jersey Civic Information Consortium, has been spoken about a lot, and it's a very different model. So can you tell us a little bit about the work that you all have been doing?
Sure, absolutely. So like Ali mentioned in the beginning, in addition to my work at Free Press, I also have the fortune and pleasure of being on the board of the New Jersey Civic Information Consortium, which is a first of its kind independent nonprofit that invests public and philanthropic dollars into supporting local news projects in the state, specifically trying to address the growing problems of news deserts and misinformation, and to support more informed communities. I've been working on this idea since 2017, when I was doing work in New Jersey, working with communities around the state to figure out ways for members of the public and journalists to collaborate together to address coverage in their community and to strengthen it. And while I was doing that work, the state of New Jersey was selling its publicly owned TV licenses and received $332 million as a result of the sale of those TV licenses. And so, Free Press, along with the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State, the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, Democracy Fund, and many others got together and said, what can we do with this windfall of money that's coming into the state? And so that began the launch of a campaign, the Civic Info Bill campaign, to pass a bill that would eventually lead to the creation of the consortium. What was really exciting about that process was that thousands of New Jersey residents from all around the state, from all different backgrounds and all different types of communities, worked together and in the campaign, people signed petitions, they lobbied their lawmakers, they called, they showed up to budget meetings, they participated in community forums. The campaign was really centered on how do we mobilize communities to not only understand what their information needs are, but also how we can get them to take action in support of a big idea that could really address the disappearing local news that was occurring in the state of New Jersey. And so the Civic Info Bill passed in 2018. And since it began doing its grant making, which began in 2020, it's given out $2.5 million in public funding and about $600,000 from foundations into all different types of projects around the state. There's been a total of 53 grants awarded in the past 2 years, supporting a geographically and racially diverse group of 35 local news organizations and media startups and news outlets representing all different types of communities, but again, really focused on underserved communities in the state. The consortium, while it receives public funding, is not a part of the state of New Jersey. It's its own independent nonprofit, and the board is comprised of public research universities in the state of New Jersey who collaborate with grantees, as well as other representatives from the technology and media field, folks who are community organizers and really deeply embedded in their communities. And so it's a relatively large board, but it's set up that way as in order to really ensure the independence of it so that neither university or political appointees have a majority vote on the board. There's other mechanisms within the legislation that protect against undue political influence. And what I'm really proud to say is that in the 2 years since we've been doing that grant making, those firewalls have really held up. I think, again, like I mentioned in the beginning, very understandable concern about editorial independence, but if policy is designed right, you can really protect that. And I think the consortium is really a model in kind of thinking through those different trappings. And I think some lessons to be learned from the not only the campaign to pass the Civic Info Bill, but also the work of the consortium thus far is that it's bipartisan in nature. We have Democrats and Republicans and independents making up the board. The campaign itself was bipartisan. There was tons of Republican and Democratic support in the legislature in favor of this, and there continues to be. We organized in communities that we organized in white rural farming communities, and we organized in urban areas, and we organized in suburbs. And the reason why I mention that is because the local news crisis is affecting communities of all different backgrounds and affects them in different ways as well. But I think that we also have found that also creates a common shared purpose for a lot of communities across the state of New Jersey when it comes to thinking about how they can support local news where they live. And in addition to the work that Krista and Rashad mentioned, there are other states as well that are looking to the consortium as potential models to be replicated where they are. I think that given the kind of unique challenges that are facing local news and that every community's needs are different, it is important that we look at and examine all different types of policies. The reason why I tend to be in favor of this direct public funding through grant making is that it provides even more flexibility to account for local information needs. The consortium, before it launched, underwent focus groups in all the communities around the state of New Jersey to hear about what their local needs were, to hear about the ideas that they had for better informing their communities. And we took all that information and we were able to incorporate that into our grant making. And I think that this model, while maybe slightly more politically fraught than like a fellowship program, we found that there was, buy-in from the legislature and the governor, especially with university backing and support, since that was kind of a system that they were already familiar with. And I think the last thing I would just mention, which would be important, actually two things, is that one, there's several folks from the consortium on this call today, so thanks for joining. We're always happy to field calls from people who are outside of New Jersey who are interested in public policy and public funding to learn about the consortium model. So folks should definitely reach out. You can just check out the website at njcivicinfo.org. And also today, the consortium announced that it would be opening up soliciting proposals from the public for an additional $1 million in grant making to new grantees But what's really exciting is that, like I mentioned before, over the course of its 2 years or so, it's given out just north of $3 million. And this year alone, it'll give out close to $4 million. And so legislators are seeing the impact of this model, and they are investing more public funds into it. And we're also beginning to gain more support from private foundations in New Jersey and elsewhere. And so it's a model that's really picking up steam and hopefully will be continue to be able to do its grant making long into the future.
Thanks, Mike. And there's a bunch of links shared in the chat as well about the work that the consortium is doing. For the last piece here, before we turn it over to audience Q&A, I'm going to welcome Deanna here from El Timpano to talk about something kind of completely different, which is how their newsroom has actually turned public funding or government support into a sustainable revenue model. So, the other side of this conversation. Deanna, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lenfest, for having us. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Like said, my name is Deanna Ballington. I work as a senior manager in civic partnership and growth for El Timpano. So El Timpano, just to start, if you guys don't know about us, we're fairly still new and small, but we're a civic media organization that informs and engages and amplifies the voices of Latino and Mayan immigrants of Oakland and the wider Bay Area. We surface community member stories and questions on local and national issues, and we provide news and information relevant to their needs. And then we also do some investigation on their concerns, and then we bring it to their attention. So we mainly do this through an SMS platform, but we have other services that we provide as well. Our audience mainly consists of Spanish and Mom-speaking immigrants, either recently to the country or that have been here, but still use Mom or Spanish as their primary language. So what does a civic partnership manager do? I know this is unconventional for a news media organization, and I actually don't come from a news media background. My background is actually in finance, so there might have been a tactic to why my founder or the founder of the organization brought me on. But as a civic partnership manager, I develop and manage relationships and partnerships with government agencies, nonprofit service providers, and others who share basically the mission or their mission aligned with Latino and Mayan immigrants that are wanting relevant information and just making sure that they are receiving the news in their primary language. So a lot of this happens with me attending coalition meetings, being on the ground, meeting with leaders of the community, and actually just a lot of relationship building, a lot of talking. And what I've learned is when we're applying for this funding, right, a lot of time there's a lot of competition. Everybody's trying to just get the money in the pot. But for example, for small CBOs or even government agencies, there's a lot of great programming out there, but they have a hard time reaching hard to reach communities. So what we tend to do is reach out to them and let them know, like, hey, El Timpano's here as a partner, right, to help you get this information out. And a lot of times these direct service or programs, they don't necessarily want to do the part of the outreach, right? It's embedded in the grant, but they sometimes don't have the funding, don't have the marketing, don't have the capacity, right? And that's where we can step in and assist. So I could talk a little bit about our revenue. Like I said, I'm a numbers person, so hopefully I don't bore you guys to death. Hopefully there's some number of people in the room. But last year we had about 67% of our revenue was foundation, 31% was civic partnership, and the rest was donations and media partners and sponsorship. In from 2021 to 2022, we raised our civic partnership revenue by 624%. So that was a great win for us. And we project to double that for this year. So some of our civic partnerships consist of, like I said, government agencies, CBOs, and then, like I said, if we apply for some public funding and don't necessarily get chosen, another strategy is going to the partners that actually did receive the funding and see if we can sub-grant through the funding that they did receive. So from the beginning of our organization, or the inception in 2019, our revenue has actually grown by 10,000%. So we're hoping this is a sustainable strategy for our revenue. And yeah, we hope that other newsrooms or other agencies see that this is profitable and can also help other programming or their journalistic side of their newsroom. So yeah, I'll give it back to you, Ali.
All right, thanks, Deanna. And again, please enter your questions into the chat. We already have a few, so I'm gonna start moderating some of that. Mike, a question for you. In New Jersey, you know that the consortium has been around for several years now. What have been some of the biggest hurdles in other states replicating that model?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's probably a few reasons. One is that while the Civic Info Bill campaign began when New Jersey got this huge windfall of money, so it got $332 million, all but 10 million of that went to plug a budget hole. And so there's only $10 million left over from that. And then there were some different hiccups in funding along the ways. But I think what we learned throughout that process, which is very much true and hard, is that, you know, state budgets are complicated. They can't run deficits or many can't run deficits like the federal government. And so there's not always, you know, $25 million like in the state of California, for instance, laying around to invest into a big model. We had built up enough relationships with lawmakers over the years that we were able to kind of keep at it. And when there were some hiccups in funding, to be able to eventually secure initial funding and then more. I think that some of the other reasons why it's been a little challenging in other states, like I kind of mentioned at the top, there's kind of this like allergic reaction within the journalism space when you talk about public policy or public funding specifically. And so it's just it's not an area that a lot of folks within the media space feel a lot of comfort in terms of advocating to their lawmakers or participating in campaigns or lobby days or things like that. But what I would really share with folks is that if, you know, to me, you know, advocacy is just all about fighting for something that you care deeply about. And if we care about the future of local news, and we recognize that public policy plays an important role, then we have to get involved in policy, because if small newsrooms or nonprofit publishers aren't, we are going to continue to see media policy that benefits incumbents, that benefits corporations, because they have lobbies and they have relationships with lawmakers. And so if we ourselves are not advocating with policymakers for this new field that we're building, then no one else will. And so I think it's just going to take a little bit of time for folks to kind of get more comfortable with talking to their lawmakers and getting involved. But what I will say is that, and you kind of heard this a little bit with what Rashad said, with what Krista said, when it comes to advocating for new public policies, it doesn't require a mass mobilization of thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Sometimes it's just the relationships you have. Lawmakers, more than a lot of other people, really, really get this problem. They may not have all the answers, but they understand that local news is disappearing and they want to do something about it. And so what we found in New Jersey was that just a few phone calls from a key lawmaker's constituent could swing them. And so one of the reasons why we haven't seen it happen in many other states is because folks aren't willing to take that next step. And I think that that's starting to shift now. So while the consortium might be a politically fraught thing in some other states, it might work in other states. Fellowships may not work in every state, but they're going to work in some states. And so I would just really encourage folks to keep kind of thinking up big ideas and contacting their lawmakers, and became really close in California to getting a consortium like model. Just a few votes and a few different things swinging one way or another, and it would have happened. So hopefully in the next few years, we'll see some more pop up.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that Krista and Rashad both said there was several different models in consideration, and the workforce development tie-in is what kind of won over the legislators and their states. So I don't know, Krista and Rashad, if you have anything to add to that about maybe why other models weren't as successful in getting across the finish line.
I can speak to our situation. State constitutions are all just really different. We have an anti-donation clause in the New Mexico Constitution, which means that the government can't directly allocate funding to a nonprofit. Like, they can't just say, like, okay, nonprofit New Mexico Local News Fund, here's money to run a program. Like, it's unconstitutional in New Mexico. You'd need to do a request for proposal process. And so that's why something like that wouldn't work here. And then the other thing that we talked about that, we got feedback about not working is potentially looking at like a tax subsidy model. There was one question about potential federal legislation. And so I answered in the Q&A about the Local News Sustainability Act, which some people are pushing. And so, as soon as the words subsidy or tax incentive left my mouth in talking with legislators, they were like, because at least here, again, this is all varies by state, but at least here in New Mexico, there's a perception that our tax code is already sort of complicated enough and has all these like special carve-outs and things like that. And there's a general sentiment right now that we should be like simplifying our tax code rather than making it more complex. So yeah, those are just some comments.
Anything to add on that front, Krista, about the other models that were suggested in California?
Yeah, not too much, but I think Mike actually knows more about the California process. And I see there's some people on this here at this participants in the webinar who are also involved in the California negotiations. I think, I'm not actually sure if there are roadblocks in California law to it. I think it was more the politics of building support for it. But I do know that the senator who sponsored this legislation is, I don't know all the details, but is hoping that with the launch of the fellowship program, that might open the door up again to thinking about some other, potentially the consortium model in California as well. Like, getting this stake in the ground might prepare people to think about something more expansive in terms of how to fund news organizations. So
that would be great. Deanna, I think that a lot of folks on the newsroom side may be a little nervous or anxious about applying for government funds because of the notion that there's so much bureaucracy, the application process, the reporting process can be burdensome. Is that a challenge you faced, or can you speak to that a bit?
Sure. I think any like grant application process isn't fun. Definitely when you get funding, the deliverables, right? You have to make sure you have the capacity for the reporting, what it entails. So it hasn't necessarily been challenging, right? You just have to navigate what you're going to do with the funds. So for our example, like, we've received large funding and it's helped us grow. In 2019, it was just our founder, and now we're up to like 6 staff, right? It doesn't sound huge, right? But for us, that's a great growth. So I think if you've been a nonprofit and applied for any public funding, it just depends on how much they want to milk out of you, I guess. But yeah, just navigating it and kind of getting an understanding of whether or not you can at the end, right, not have to take the funding, which a lot of times doesn't happen, but yeah, just making sure you have the proper staffing in place.
And I just put a plug into the chat, but there's a whole building a revenue team session coming up after this. So if you're interested, we got a question from Aparna that I'm gonna maybe shoot over to Krista. I'm curious about the challenges and opportunities for larger states that have a geographic delineation and how legislation and coverage is often perceived. Thinking of Albany and upstate versus New York City, and California, of course, has so many different regions, each with their own distinct needs and ecosystems. So, Krista, can you speak a little bit about how you're approaching that in California?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty simple answer. We're very conscious. I mean, California is a huge state. There are distinct regions, and we want to make sure that we're being extremely thoughtful about geographic placement of the fellows across the state. Certainly in this first year, and I think we'll learn a lot about what's working and where the greatest needs are. For now, we don't have I thought about, in the selection process, should we sort of break the state up into 3 or 4 regions and make sure that we've sort of got similar coverage of like larger news organizations, smaller news organizations in each one. I think it's so hard to know before this launches who's actually going to apply and how widespread the interest is. So we're keeping a kind of open approach this year, but being very thoughtful about geography in our selection. And then we may get more targeted in years 2 and 3 about how we think about the regions. Yeah.
In my former role, actually, I worked closely with the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, and there it was more of a direct re-granting model, but they based it on the population of each county. So there was kind of like this big mathematical formula that says this much of the money has to go to this county because that's where the people live. Certainly wasn't perfect, but is one example of how you might do that. Another question, and I think, Rashad, you may have spoken about this a little bit, but have you had any success, I guess, in kind of influencing or swaying or getting in the door with these legislators? Have you been able to do that kind of yourself? Or have you needed to have allies in, someone asked about large chains or corporations or, who we consider, more formal lobbying organizations?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. First of all, big shout out to Mark Glazer, who's been putting resources in the chat, who works with me at the New Mexico Local News Fund. Really it's really just been the core staff of the New Mexico Local News Fund that's been doing this work. Mark is taking the lead, partly because he lives in Santa Fe, and so it's easier for him to see legislators at the Capitol. But we have a Southern New Mexico project coordinator who runs our Southern New Mexico programs, and she's spoken with legislators from Southern New Mexico. I've met with several people in Albuquerque that represent the Albuquerque area, and then Mark has done most of our outreach, like actually in Santa Fe during the legislative session so far. And I guess I'd just say, remember that legislators are people. I know they sound like they're some weird alien species, but I promise they're just people like us that are interested in making their state a better place. And so, just speak to what their interests and needs are, and you'll get their support if it's something that's really worth doing and will benefit communities in the state. Oh, and sorry, and regarding the chain issue, Gannett has a really large presence in New Mexico. Well, large geographically, not so much staff-wise anymore, unfortunately. I have really great relationships with some of the leadership of the Gannett papers. They have hosted several of our fellows in the past. It's been a fairly smooth process, I would say. But I'm sure that'll just vary based on, leadership at chains in your states. The leadership at Gannett Papers here, is mostly people from New Mexico with pretty deep ties to the region. It's not someone that just was flown in from some other part of the country. So that helps a lot.
Great. We have time for just a couple more questions. Deanna, there's a question from someone in the chat. If you could speak a little more specifically about some examples of, you mentioned partnership revenue, either subgranting or contracting with other nonprofits. What are some examples of ways that you've done that?
Sure. So, for example, trying to think of all these meetings I've had. The local city of Oakland, right? They have a lot of programming that doesn't necessarily reach the Hmong and Spanish speaking communities. So this last meeting I had, they wanted to share, well, there's been the local city of Oakland. I feel like I'm managing a jungle because it's so big. But there are different departments, right? So there's emergency preparedness department, right? That they actually have a text messaging service, but it's not in Spanish. So they need to obviously reach these large communities. And so they've reached out to us. And then sub-granting just comes with just us talking, right, to other CBOs. And if we heard from them, one I can think of is one called Tech Exchange. So they were distributing laptops and providing health literacy information. We subgranted and just got some funding to target certain zip codes, right, and certain communities in Oakland. So yeah, a lot of times it's I honestly, what I do is if there is a large grant that goes out there, it's public information, right? So there's a list of who's getting the funding, and if they're mission aligned with El Timpano, or if I think that they might not necessarily have the resources to reach the communities that we're serving, I just do a quick email and a phone call.
I mean, it's so similar to the way that folks look at a similar organization and look at the list of their funders and reach out to those funders. It's just kind of like flipping it on its head and partnering with other nonprofits or other newsrooms instead of going right to the funder. So I think that's a brilliant approach. All right, our last question. Krista mentioned earlier that they're going to, launch this year and start their process for evaluation and impact tracking. Mike, the consortium in New Jersey is a little bit further along. Can you speak at all about how you've evaluated your impact or success and how that may be changing year after year?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I would just say stay tuned. The consortium, the host university of the Civic Information Consortium is the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State, and we are working with them and their research director to be developing impact metrics and kind of different things to measure progress of grantees and things like that. And so that should be coming out relatively soon. And I do think the one thing I would say, and this is probably more anecdotal than like research based, is that a lot of the organizations that the consortium supports are non-commercial. Doesn't mean that we can't support commercial outlets, but a lot of them are non-commercial. And so when I think about the impact that the consortiums have on the state of New Jersey, it's that there are a lot of news organizations that otherwise would not be in existence if it were not for the consortium, that receive investment from them, have been able to secure additional funding from other sources. But I think that actually really speaks to the power of public funding is that it actually, like when combined with philanthropy, can actually help create new models that are sustainable. And so what I'm really excited to see once we have a little bit more data back, hopefully sometime this year, is to actually have a better understanding of the impact that these organizations are having on their communities and to have a better understanding of how similar models like that can be supported around the state.
Amazing. Well, I think that is our time today. So huge thank you to Deanna, Krista, Mike, Rashad. This has been a really meaty session, at least for me. Rest assured, we will be sharing out not only the recording, but all of the really wonderful resources and links that were shared in the chat following the summit. So we can all come back to it. Our next block of programming for the summit kicks off in a half an hour at 2 p.m. Eastern. So we hope you'll join us again then. And until then, thank you. We'll see you soon.